discusses his memoir, I Want to Thank My Brain for Remembering Me. Then at 9 from Brown University, a panel discussion on the state of literature. About Books continues Sunday at 9 with an interview with editor Jane Garrett. She talks about some of the prize-winning books she's edited during her career. At 9:30, a reading by author Frank McCourt, and at 10:30, retired federal judge Leon Higginbotham talks about his new book, Shades of Freedom. About Books, Saturday and Sunday nights here on C-SPAN 2.
Next, the role of the CIA in the post-Cold War era. Robert White, head of the Center for International Policy, discusses the issue and his efforts at public accountability for the agency. The Women's National Democratic Club hosted the event.
Before we start today's program, just a couple of announcements of up-and-coming luncheons. This Thursday, we have Karen Nussbaum, who will talk about women, labor unions, and campaign of '96. This is our last speaker before the elections to address the issues facing us in this campaign. And then I urge you all on November 5th, next Tuesday, please put it on your calendar, take a friend, go and vote. And the club will be closed for food during the day because we will be having our party that evening. And as of now, we have over 100 people signed up to come. We will be learning the Macarena. We will be, and I'll give you a little hint of our food. Our Arkansas light fare, Alma tells me, is probably going to be Arkansas barbecue on buns, cornbread, and collard greens. So I hope you all will join us for that evening. I would like to welcome all our guests today, and I invite you too to come to our election party on November 5th. I'd like to make special welcome to the ambassador's wife, who is with us today, Marianne White. Thank you for coming, Marianne. She's sitting down here. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Dorothy Dillon, our Vice President for Programs, who I know needs no introduction to all of us. But it's only appropriate that I call on Dorothy, who arranged this program today and is also a longtime friend of Ambassador White's, to introduce him to us. Dorothy? Please welcome her with an applause.
Thank you very much. I am very pleased today to introduce a fellow radical. Let me explain. We have a group of retired Foreign Service officers who have served most or all their careers in Latin America, and we meet once a month at Decor House to have lunch, and usually with a speaker. Now, these are a mixture of Democrats and Republicans. I don't know what the actual mix is. I would suspect they're more Democrats than Republicans, but they're a fairly conservative bunch in the old meaning of conservative, you know, the classical historical meaning. Change, but not too much and not too fast, but not going backwards. Well, Bob White and Wayne Smith, who most of you know because he has spoken here at the club many times, and myself, we're sort of the three radicals of the group. At least they look upon us as kind of radicals. And I use that in the original sense of the term, liking to get to the root of problems, not in the way it is generally used. Ambassador White has spent most of his career in Latin America. He has served in many countries. He ended up as ambassador in Paraguay and then in El Salvador. Prior to that, he had served as head of the Latin American Peace Corps. He even made one tour of duty in Canada in his early career. So he's been other places than Latin America, but most of the time there. For the last 8 years or so, he has been president of the Center for International Policy, which is a private, independent think tank here in Washington. And the particular project that he's engaged in at the moment is a year-long project with the World Affairs, in collaboration with the World Affairs Council, to study what should be the role of the Central Intelligence Agency in the post-Cold War world. You know, there's been a lot of press attention to the CIA recently. Various allegations have been made about their activities, and I think it's a very good time to take a look at what it has been and where we would like to see it go. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce Ambassador Robert E. White, who will talk to us about his ideas and the Center's ideas on the future of the CIA.
Thank you, Dorothy, for that kind introduction. Dorothy Dillon herself played a strong and constructive role over many years with the U.S. Information Agency. President Chase, it's a pleasure to be with you today. If we had to choose one time and one place where United States foreign policy went wrong, in my opinion, that place would be Guatemala, and that date would be 1954. Confronted with a government unresponsive to U.S. pressures, the CIA overthrew that elected government and replaced it with a military dictatorship. Since that time, the CIA has worked closely with the Guatemalan army, the owner of the worst human rights record in this hemisphere. Recently, I traveled to Guatemala, and I met with a member of the Guatemalan legislature, a man with an outstanding democratic and centrist record. Now, this legislator was less impressed than several members of our delegation thought he should be with the Clinton administration's support for democracy and for human rights. Yes, he said, Ambassador Marilyn McAfee had carried out an admirable policy designed to advance negotiations towards a peace treaty between the government and the revolutionary movement. Yes, Ambassador McAfee had consistently supported democracy and human rights. Yet he hinted there were officials in the embassy who contravened and subverted the policy being carried out by the ambassador. To illustrate his point, he asked the delegation, why is it, do you think, that the United States has the most stable government in the hemisphere? I groaned inwardly, for I knew what was coming. The United States is the most stable country in the hemisphere, he said, because there is no American embassy in Washington. For the last 40 years, this story has been told and retold, the length and breadth of Latin America. Yet it still has the power to dismay at least this former Foreign Service officer. American embassies and consulates around the world exist to safeguard American interests in a manner consistent with national honor. Diplomacy, divorced from ethical standards and international law, betrays the values of the United States and undercuts the relationships of confidence with foreign governments so necessary to the achievement of our national objectives. Unfortunately, the cynicism of the Guatemalan legislator was demonstrated to be well-founded. A few months later, after the delegation returned, the President's Intelligence Oversight Board, assigned to investigate the CIA role in Guatemala, recognized that the CIA had been working at cross purposes with the ambassador and that CIA officers had lied to the Congress about their activities. This investigation and these revelations came about in large part because of the courage of Sister Diana Ortiz and Jennifer Harbury, both of whom had suffered grievous harm at the hands of the Guatemalan military. And it was only achieved with the vital support of Congressman Bob Torricelli, who had the basic integrity to put the life of Jennifer Harbury above the secrecy designed to protect the CIA from its own wrongdoing and ineptitude. In August of this year, the San Jose Mercury News published a series by Gary Webb accusing the CIA of permitting Nicaraguan drug traffickers in Los Angeles to finance the Contra war through the sale of crack cocaine. These charges remain unproved, and there is ample reason to believe that the newspaper, through its graphics and headlines, overstated its case. CIA Director John Deutsch has ordered an internal CIA review of these charges. If the CIA review concentrates solely on the Los Angeles connection, I have little doubt that the CIA will be found largely innocent. If, however, the review includes, as it should, Contra drug running into Florida and other cities, the results of the investigation could and should be dramatically different. As Jack Blum, former special counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, stated in his brilliant testimony before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence last week, quote, "There was, however, plenty of evidence that policymakers closed their eyes to the criminal behavior of some of America's allies and supporters in the Contra war. The policymakers ignored the drug dealing, their stealing, their human rights violations. Policymakers allowed the Contras to compensate themselves for helping us by remaining silent in the face of their impropriety and by quietly undercutting the law enforcement and human rights agencies that might have caused them difficulty." Blum continued, "A careful review of the history of covert operations in the Caribbean and South and Central America show a 40-year connection between crime and covert operations that has repeatedly blown back on the United States. The same history will show that operations in the region were for the most part moral and political failures. Other operations in Asia and Europe have had similar consequences, the worst in the narcotics area," end of quote. Oliver North himself mentions in his notes, those notes at least that escaped destruction at his hands, that he had advised the Drug Enforcement Agency that illegal drugs had entered the United States on Contra supply planes. How a nation is organized to conduct its foreign policy will determine in large measure the nature of that policy. Before the Cold War, the management of U.S. foreign policy was centered in a single department responsible to the president. The emergence of several contending agencies has not only complicated and hampered the making of foreign policy, but it has led to an exaggeration of threats from abroad as each agency competes for power, access, and resources. In this competition for the foreign policy dollar, overt diplomacy has come up the loser, and covert activity the clear winner. As Thomas Friedman wrote in the New York Times this Sunday, budget cuts have forced the State Department to close over 30 embassies and consulates and shut down 25% of the USIA libraries around the world. Yet the budgets of the intelligence agencies sail through the Congress largely untouched. When the CIA was born, Secretary of State Dean Acheson expressed the gravest foreboding, his words, about the agency, warning that once in being, quote, neither the president nor anyone else would be in a position to know what it was doing or control it. Of all the U.S. government institutions that evolved to fight the Cold War, the CIA came to symbolize that era. The CIA assumed the role of carrying the fight against the Soviet Union and against international communism. The cult of secrecy that grew up around the agency gave it the ability, enviable for a bureaucracy, but at odds with our constitutional system, of being able to justify, without public scrutiny, the rationale for its own existence and activities. Covert action has involved our country in the overthrow of the elected government of Guatemala, the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, the formation and training of the death-dealing Battalion 316 in Honduras, the sponsorship of the decade-long butchery in El Salvador, the destruction of Nicaragua through the manufacture of civil war, and a long list of less spectacular disasters. And I might add that perhaps the chief entity to suffer was our own constitutional system. The one commodity never in short supply in Central America and the Caribbean is information. Yet the CIA insists it must recruit and maintain on the payroll gross and consistent violators of human rights in order to gather intelligence. In my experience, this claim is false and self-serving and merits the most intense scrutiny by congressional committees. Men like General Manuel Noriega of Panama, General Gustavo Alvarez of Honduras, Colonel Roberto Alcaraz of Guatemala, and Emmanuel Constant of Haiti enjoyed profitable contractual arrangements with the CIA, not because they were particularly important sources of information, but because they served as paid agents of influence who promoted actions or policies favored by the CIA in that country. These CIA policies usually, but not always, coincided with national policy. This is not, let me assure you, of mere historical interest. Let us take the case of Haiti. President Clinton made it clear from the outset of his administration that it was his policy to restore President Aristide and constitutional government to Haiti. Yet, there is no disguising the fact that the CIA undercut this policy. The CIA leaked a psychological profile filled with damaging misinformation about President Aristide. CIA Director James Woolsey revealed to a congressional committee that the CIA had kept on the payroll several of the coup leaders most vicious in their crushing of democratic rule. And for reasons never explained, the CIA recruited Emmanuel Constant, the leader of a gang of thugs who spread terror throughout Haiti by intimidating and killing leading Aristide supporters. The CIA has made clandestine collection of intelligence and covert action normal, routine features of U.S. foreign policy. No more certain way to undermine diplomacy and destroy trust between nations can be found. There is a role, there is indeed a definite role for an intelligence agency in monitoring threats of nuclear proliferation, in keeping a careful eye on the development of weapons systems by potential enemies of the United States, by monitoring terrorism and perhaps narcotics. Instead of concentrating on these real threats, the swollen bureaucracy of the CIA has imposed huge numbers of its operatives on U.S. embassies in countries with open societies. In many overseas posts, CIA staff outnumber legitimate diplomats. I put it to you that that is a shocking statement. The Center for International Policy has begun its own assessment of national security requirements. This initiative was born out of disappointment with the official commissions, the Presidential Commission and the commission headed by Larry Combest in the House of Representatives, Representative Larry Combest. Far from proposing reform, these reports have instead meekly endorsed the intelligence community's current operations and budget. Representative Combest even said that his primary job was not oversight of the CIA, but advocate for the CIA. This is a new definition of the role of these oversight committees. The project of the Center for International Policy is directed by Melvin Goodman, a former high CIA official. Working with Mr. Goodman on this project are former ambassadors, former CIA officers, former members of the National Security Council, as well as academic experts in national security and several investigative journalists. The overall objective of this project is to ascertain if national security can be protected by increasing democratic accountability, including declassification and reducing secrecy, by ending covert operations, except in times of genuine national peril, and only against enemies of the United States, by restoring intelligence to its proper supportive role in the conduct of foreign relations, by entering mutual agreements with other democratic governments to end espionage and covert operations in each other's countries, by using our intelligence capacity in a more creative way to monitor agreements on international security, by seeking to reduce terrorism, economic espionage, and transnational crime, working to end these scourges. As I said, how a country is organized to conduct its foreign policy will determine to a great extent the nature of that policy. If 90 cents out of every dollar goes for foreign policy goes to the military and to this and to the intelligence community, then you should not be surprised if the solutions that are presented to the president, or the recommendations that are presented to the president, emphasize military solutions and intelligence and covert actions. Over the past 4 decades, we have overfunded spying and underfunded diplomacy. As a result, the United States has too frequently departed from the path of judicious application of diplomatic influence to gain legitimate objectives. We have trampled on sovereignty, judicial equality, and territorial integrity. Principles that have served for centuries as the norms of conduct among independent states. In the full awareness that the world is still a dangerous place, I believe it is time to reassert these fundamental principles and give them the preeminence that they deserve by setting aside covert means, at least until legitimate, open diplomacy has been tried and found wanting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you have questions for Ambassador White, please write them on the card provided at your table and hold them up for the hostess to bring to the front. As your first question,
Yes.
let's see if I can read this. Assuming a second Clinton administration, how and what, maybe I should have you read this, Dorothy.
I guess, assuming a second Clinton administration, how and what should be done to reform the CIA?
Assuming a Clinton victory, which I do, how should we reform the CIA? I think the first step would be to separate operations from analysis. As most of you are aware, the CIA really divides into two parts. The analytical unit, which, at least theoretically, brings in all the information from overt sources, from covert sources, from newspapers, from every source possible, and then writes, prepares estimates, prepares assessments of important foreign policy issues to the president, situation reports, if you will. In our view, it is vital to separate this analytical function from the operational function, from the dirty tricks department. Because we know from history, let us take the example of William Casey as head of the Central Intelligence Agency. It is well known and public that several important CIA analysts left the CIA because Director Casey rejected those analyses that did not meet his expectations, that did not support the Reagan policies in Central America. This puts analysis at the servant, casts analysis, in a sense, as the servant of policy. And there inevitably are these pressures, even if you have a CIA director who understands and sympathizes with the need to keep the two functions separate. For example, the former CIA director, one former CIA director, in fact, the first CIA director under President Clinton, stated publicly that he had put CIA operatives from one region together with the CIA analysts from another region, from the same region. In other words, he put operatives together with analysts in order to facilitate communication. But you see, this is precisely what should not be done. Because what happens is that it gives privileged access to information that is clandestinely acquired. And in my view, at least in 90% of the world, most of the valuable information comes from overt sources. So I think that's the basic recommendation that I would make in order to in order to ensure that the president gets unbiased analysis and separates it from operations.
I've been asked to come up here so they can hear back there, so I will join you up here on the podium.
Good.
Has any disciplinary or corrective action been taken against the CIA officials who so consistently sabotage U.S. policy in Haiti?
Not to my knowledge. And indeed, this is a very important issue that cries out for congressional investigation. There was no ambiguity in President Clinton's policy. He stated right from the outset that it was his policy to restore constitutional government and to restore President Aristide to the people of Haiti. And yet, in spite of that, and he succeeded in getting an agreement whereby the military of Haiti would permit President Aristide to return. And yet, the military, after signing that, faithlessly violated its pledged word. Now, why did they do it? Well, when the CIA director revealed that we still had on the payroll key members of the junta that overthrew President Aristide, it seemed to many observers that the Haitian generals and colonels believed that they had a friend and advocate in Washington, and that if they were still on the payroll, that we really could not be serious about President Clinton's policy. Let me tell you that the militaries of Central America and the Caribbean have long ago learned to divide the United States government up into good guys and bad guys, and to those elements that they listen to, and to those elements that they do not listen to. And in particular, you do listen to the people who pay you. And that, I think, is the explanation for a great deal of our trouble in this region.
Bob, how would you structure a reformed CIA to eliminate its station's third country operations, which enable it to exclude the ambassador and/or DCM from all oversight responsibilities?
This question puts a problem succinctly and well. In theory, the ambassador is charged by the president to oversee all operations in the country, except if there happens to be a military operation in progress. But there is a blatant and regrettable exception, and that is that the CIA is exempt from the crucial features of ambassadorial responsibility. I think that the key here is to appoint ambassadors who are truly qualified. This does not mean that they all have to be career people, not by any means. Some of our most outstanding ambassadors have been men like John Kenneth Galbraith or Daniel Patrick Moynihan. But we must have men and women who have the ability and the background to discharge their responsibilities and to have the respect of the country team. Right now, I have known cases where the Central Intelligence Agency was blocked from running an operation in one area of the world, not Latin America, because of the good sense and prudence of a deputy chief of mission. In order to escape his surveillance and his vetoing, they moved the whole operation to a neighboring country where there was a more pliable ambassador. We simply have to have a rule where the ambassador knows and has to approve any operation by the CIA.
Why do you think the CIA was so far off the mark in evaluating the state of the Soviet Union?
That they were off the mark, there is no doubt. In 1988, then Deputy Director, I believe, Robert Gates, testified that the Soviet Union was stronger than ever and that we need a large increase in military spending in order to counter the increasing strength of the Soviet Union. This is the time when any casual observer, and I went to the Soviet Union about 12 times during that period, and it was clear to anyone with an eye to see that the Soviet Union was not a functioning entity. Let me just tell you one anecdote. The Center for International Policy ran the first operation, the first conference, not an operation, the first conference in Afghanistan with former U.S. diplomats and academics and with Afghanis and with Russians, designed to see if there wasn't a way to cut short the end of the Afghan war. When I was with, in 1988, I was in Moscow with this high Soviet official, and we were having a drink and dinner after a hard day's work. And in came a group of Chinese. And he looked up and he said, "Those Chinese," he said, "they're so hardworking and clever they can even make communism work." Now, I think that, you know, that kind of, it was not difficult. But I believe that there has been a reciprocal, rewarding relationship between the Central Intelligence Agency and let me put it this way, the CIA needs enemies. Because if you have friends out there, you really don't need all that many dirty tricks. So I believe there is an active search underway at all time to locate and enemies that I'm not at all sure are necessarily enemies.
Senator Moynihan says to close down CIA and leave intelligence to agencies in the Pentagon. Do you agree?
Well, I hear the groans from the audience, but I have to tell you that there is something to Senator Moynihan's recommendation. You have to put up, assuming you need operations at all, and I would like to reiterate our current recommendation, still in the process of formulation, that covert action should be ended unless we are close to war, unless we are truly confronting an enemy and a sense of national emergency prevails throughout our country. I think that covert actions have inevitably, as Jack Blum said, blown back on the United States. For example, the huge amount of money that we showered, that the CIA showered on a fanatic named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in Afghanistan, a man who led the most extreme fundamentalist wing. And yet he is also, as outlined in Professor Alfred McCoy's recent book, one of the leading heroin traffickers in that region. And this is an appalling fact that there is a relationship, and here I recommend Dr. McCoy's book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, or actually it's now updated to just be called The Politics of Heroin, to all of you. But if you're going to have operations, then you have to put them somewhere. And one thing I will say about the Pentagon is that it has command and control. I do not think that if the Pentagon had charge of this type of activity, that you would get the kind of cowboy mentality that we have seen in too many cases.
Can the Department of State be reinvigorated and restored to its former importance?
No country can be great without a great foreign service. No country can achieve its role in the world without a first-class diplomacy. Yet, the State Department has been put into the same category as the Department of Commerce, the Department of the Interior, etc., and suffers the same cuts as all of these other departments. Whereas the Pentagon and the CIA live behind the firewall of national security. Their budgets are basically untouchable. Even when the CIA, or the intelligence community was discovered, the National Reconnaissance Office, an organization that many of you may never have heard of, stole $4 billion and put it in a kitty for future use. They had already put up a building in Northern Virginia that the Congress had never heard of. Then a few sort of Don Quixote Democrats like Pat Schroeder and Barney Frank tried to take the $4 billion back and put it in the general treasury, which seemed to me a really good idea, because if you steal that kind of money and get caught at it, there should be some penalty. No, Chairman Combest and a group of his supporters actively worked and won out in restoring this $4 billion, stolen $4 billion back into the intelligence community budget. And so I believe that it is essential for the State Department to be looked upon as the key player in foreign policy, and the key actor, the front line in our national security. But I have to say that up until now, I see very little evidence that the consciousness of the importance of the State Department has penetrated very far. And part of our project is designed to dramatize the lack of proportionality between the funding lavished on some agencies and the penury that causes the State Department to have to close vital installations overseas.
The Nicaraguan election of last week repudiated the Sandinistas. What does this mean for Nicaragua?
The first thing to note about that is that it was a fair election, and that the man who got the most votes is going to be ushered in as the next president of Nicaragua, and that the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega recognize that they have lost the election and will now go into the posture of the loyal opposition. This is a very important development. It was unfortunate that both candidates represented extreme views. The Nicaraguan people are basically a people that like to compromise, that like to work things out peacefully. And I think that if we can continue to play, as Ambassador John Maisto in Nicaragua has played a wonderfully important and positive role in making certain that all Nicaraguans understood that the United States had no favorites in this race. And I think as long as we can maintain that posture of support for democracy, but without getting involved in the internal affairs of the country, the Nicaraguans will slowly and surely rebuild their country. I will regret that the United States seems to have unlimited funds to destroy Central America, but has almost no money at all to help it rebuild.
What is the source of the CIA tendency to undercut U.S. policy? Does it come from within the Bureau, within the bureaucracy, or is it the larger intelligence community as a whole?
Most of the money that goes to intelligence does not go to the CIA. Most of the money that goes for intelligence goes for satellites, for bases and platforms, for electronic eavesdropping. Now, we have to, in any sort of reassessment of foreign policy, we should take a look at how this $25 billion or so is spent, and what's the record of these efforts, and do they really serve? Do you really need to spend that much money on gadgetry? But I will say this, that if you leave aside the huge amounts of money, I have never known any government to protest the fact that satellites fly above their country taking photographs. I've never known a government to object to the existence of a national security agency that has the most sophisticated listening gear in the world. Maybe American citizens should think about it, but I've never known any foreign government. So what we can say is that as expensive as these toys are, they don't interfere with the normal conduct of U.S. foreign policy. What we have to worry about is that while covert action and clandestine collection of information, while that part of the budget represents only a small percentage of the overall intelligence budget, it is the people who have been involved in covert action that have given the ethos to the CIA. The deputy directors and directors of the CIA have mostly been drawn from the ranks of covert operators. I mean, the top ranks, not necessarily the director. So what you have to concern yourself with here is not just raw figures of dollars spent, but that the CIA tends to see its fortunes tied up with the elites that rule in developing countries. It may be that the Soviet Union was the enemy, but the CIA played out its role primarily in the countries of the Third World. And when you have on your payroll leading members of the military and important politicians, then elitist government, oligarchic government, even dictatorial government becomes a very comfortable arrangement for the Central Intelligence Agency. When you have a democracy, when you have an Aristide, say, then as a result of elections, the elites lose at least a good part of their influence in the society and have to educate and have to exercise what influence they do have in a more open, responsible way. So I think that there is a natural tendency for the CIA to be comfortable with oligarchic dictatorial government. Certainly that has been the history.
We read in the press that Latin America is more democratic than ever in history. How do you square this with your allegations of CIA subversion of democracy?
It's true that it is true that there is now more democracy in Latin America than ever before. We would have, however, had democracy decades before this, had it not been for the propensity of the CIA and the United States government to distrust democratic leaders. The United States record over the years in Latin America has unfortunately been that of support for dictatorship. There have been some honorable exceptions. John Kennedy and his Alliance of Progress. There were failings, but by and large, the direction of Kennedy policy was towards democracy. Jimmy Carter, who brought in human rights into the vocabulary of U.S. foreign policy. This was a tremendous achievement because the Latin Americans pay real attention. They have no alternative to the policies of the United States. And once President Carter put forth human rights as an organizing principle of U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America, we had something around which we could build real support for democracy. And that gave a great impetus to the democratic movement in Latin America. I also want to recognize that President Bush, by many of his actions, particularly his emphasis on freer trade, and I applaud freer trade, although I recognize its limitations and problems, I think also made a considerable contribution to democracy. But make no mistake, the Latin Americans would have had democratic governments, and we would have been spared Iran Contra and a host of other less spectacular disasters had we not had the CIA.
What is the current state of the State Department's intelligence function?
The Intelligence and Research Bureau, INR as it's called, of the State Department, has an excellent reputation. It does first-class work. I have not seen it recently, but that is its reputation. I think that the point is that the more open your intelligence analysts are, the more ability they have to communicate with scholars in universities, the more frequently their assessments are put to the test, see the light of day and are known, the better your intelligence analysis becomes. The one thing that strikes me as certain to defeat first-class analysis is secrecy. I recently spoke with a former member of the National Security Council who told me that the last place that they looked for intelligence analysis was the Central Intelligence Agency. The first place they looked was CNN, because, and this is an important point, is an important point that CNN, C-SPAN, other places, other entities like that actually bring the news and diffuse that important events throughout the entire policy community. I ask you to think how much it costs, both in money and in time, to get something that is top secret, no distribution, around this government so that all policymakers are informed. It takes days and perhaps weeks. How long does it take if you have it in the Washington Post? It's a minute. And so secrecy is a highly overrated commodity. As a matter of fact, in my view, one of the chief purposes of these various gradations that try to limit distribution is to build up a small group of people at the top who can say, if you knew what I knew, you wouldn't hold those views. And that, I tell you, nothing more destructive of intelligent policy analysis could be found.
Inspector Robert White, can you speak on the fact that the allegations are that more than 200 tons of crack cocaine have been brought into this government by the CIA during the Contras, and how they brought weapons to this government? And in fact, I know you're aware of the fact that our inspector, our senator from Pennsylvania, have been involved in the Senate committee
I'm sorry,
on
are you
intelligence
finished?
on that. Do you demand that we have a public hearing on the fact that our money was used to bring in over 200 tons of crack cocaine and weapons into our community, into the United States, to fund the Contras?
I'm sorry, you don't have to answer that if you don't want to. You're supposed to put it in writing, and I would appreciate any more questions in writing.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I would like to answer it, Madam President. As I said, I do believe that the Contras and people connected with the Contras brought in huge amounts of cocaine into this country. I also believe that people in the Central Intelligence Agency and in other responsible posts in government knew about this and looked the other way. I think that open hearings are an excellent idea. And I worry very much that this internal CIA investigation will not respond, will answer very narrow questions and not treat of the legitimate concerns of this gentleman and in particular the black community. Because as Jack Blum pointed out, in this country we have a particular definition of the cocaine problem or the drug problem. And that is that if you are an addict, you only get into trouble if you violate the law by stealing money in order to feed your habit. If you're a doctor or a lawyer and have ample resources, then you are not a problem by the definition of our society. And I think that this is something that does need to be thought about and addressed, and I think that there is a need for the catharsis to find out indeed what were our officials doing during this cocaine, the import of by the Contras and people associated with them during the 80s.
So should we have an independent prosecutor like the Whitewater hearings, an independent prosecutor like the Watergate hearings to deal with this issue, since it's our tax money that they've used?
Okay, thank you very much. I think our time is out. There is a paper that you have in the back that people can take as they go out. Would you like to mention that?
A few, anybody who wants, I have some cards here, anybody who wants to have any of the material that I've referred to or information about our project, if you just leave a card with me or with one of my associates, we would be glad, pleased to inform you about the ongoing state of our deliberations. Thank you very much. But given the lily white nature
Pick that up.